Welcome to the kickoff to this month's series, Climate Grief and Growth, co-hosted by Reimagine and the Good Grief Network. And I want to wish everyone a happy International Women's Day. Let's give a shout out to all the women who are leading action around climate change and the environment. My name is Andrew Engel, and I'm senior programmer at Reimagine. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a white cisgender male, and I've got glasses, salt and pepper hair, a flannel shirt, and a bright orange background. Reimagine's mission is to help people of all backgrounds face adversity, loss, and mortality, and channel the hard parts of life into meaningful action and growth. And since the roots of our organization are in the end-of-life space, I borrowed a concept from a colleague of ours at Reimagine, Dr. Craig Blinderman. He leads palliative care at Columbia University Medical Center. And in a program we did, that was back in 2020, and it was a program about artistic interventions on climate change, both in the cities of Venice and in New York City. Craig had asked the question, how do we confront a scenario in which we can only palliate a dying city? And I was going back and forth with my colleague, Laura Schmidt, the founder of Good Grief Network. And I'm still not sure if the hospice metaphor is apt for planet Earth. But what I do know for sure is that the planet's caretakers really need grief support and respite. The climate crisis is increasingly responsible for more disaster, death, suffering, and anxiety. We are actively destroying landscapes and bodies of water, both with intent and negligence. Governments and corporations have ignored warnings from scientists, from spiritual leaders, and activists. But despite it all, I feel that there's some comfort with all of us gathering here today. The first step is to learn. Our intention for today is that this group of esteemed speakers, that includes Leslie Davenport, Kyle Hill, and Tori Tsui, who cut across a variety of professional, cultural, and geographic backgrounds, will provide you with some fundamentals on climate grief. Laura, I'm going to pass this to you to say a few words about Good Grief Network and tell us about what's ahead for this series. And I just want to say first, it's been such a pleasure and a joy to collaborate with you on this series.
Thanks, Andy. I also want to echo the gratitude for working with you. I know you've put in a lot of time and energy to make today happen and gather us all here. So as Andy said, I'm Laura Schmidt. I breathed life into the nonprofit Good Grief Network with the help of my wife, Amy Lewis Rowe. We at Good Grief Network use a 10-step program to bring people together to face the painful realities of our time. We create spaces to process our feelings so we don't get stuck in them. And we arrive at inspired action that we can take in these tumultuous times. We're excited to announce that we have a book coming out in August through Shambhala Publications. It's called How to Live in a Chaotic Climate, 10 Steps to Reconnect with Ourselves, Our Communities, and Our Planet. We have a very exciting day today planned for you. Of course, we promise a lot of learning is in store. And next week, our focus will be on taking action. It'll be in dialogue with Buddhist teacher Kyra Jewel Lingo. And that will be followed by breakout sessions that inspire small, sweet steps to navigate our grief. And then in the third session, I'm going to lead a workshop featuring creative exercises to honor our losses and to process climate grief and the overwhelming feelings with regard to ecocide.
Thank you, Laura. As some of you may know, we at Reimagine have been leaning into the process and philosophy of post-traumatic growth. PTG is evidence-based psychological research that allows us to recognize opportunity and experience change when struggling with grief, loss, or trauma. The kinds of growth that can occur include an increase in personal strength, optimism, more meaningful relationships, a deeper appreciation of life, and heightened spirituality and purpose. And there are several pathways to experiencing these changes, such as telling your story, which is what our guests will do today. And perhaps you can share some of your own experiences and stories in the chat. We'd love to see that. So the majority of us are zooming in from the United States, also known as Turtle Island by Native Americans and their allies. I'm in Lenapehoking, where a large city called New York is located on occupied land. Wherever you are, I ask you to join me in acknowledging Indigenous communities in North America, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. And I'm stating this because it's a step, a small, sweet step, towards dismantling the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism and white supremacy. So let us know where you are if you haven't already. I've put a link in the chat to native-land.ca. You can check that out to learn about locations of Indigenous people. For those who wish, click on the CC icon at the bottom of your Zoom screens to get a live transcript of what's being said. And another helpful Zoom tip, you can save the chat by clicking on the 3 dots in the chat box. And feel free to send me a note in the chat privately if you're having any technical issues. I might be able to help you. And I want you to know that everyone who registered for this session today will get a follow-up email with a recording. We've got some excellent speakers today. I mentioned them earlier. I encourage you to read their full bios in the event listing, and I'm also going to be pasting links about them in the chat. And after our discussion, we'll have Q&A. So please use the chat to pose your questions. I might call on some of you. And that's it. I'm going to hand this back over to Laura.
All right, thank you again. Huge welcome once again to everybody in our panelists rather. We're going to start out by asking some general information from each panelist, what your background is, what brings you here. So my first question more clearly is, tell us a little bit more about your work and what climate grief is. How does climate grief impact you and your community? And Tori, we'd like to start with you, please.
Of course. Hi, everyone. My name is Tori Tsui. I use she, her pronouns. I've got a short little bob with a fringe. And yeah, I am mixed race, half Chinese, half English. And I reside in Bristol, but I'm originally from Hong Kong. And I moved to the UK for my studies, but also because of the political unrest that was occurring during the national security law implementation. And my work primarily focuses on the impacts of the climate crisis on mental health of those, the global majority. I think most of the time when it comes to conversations around things like eco-anxiety and climate grief, a lot of the mainstream fixations tend to be on those in the global north. And so, you know, I started writing a book called It's Not Just You to really hone in on some of the experiences that people are experiencing worldwide. And I think the title is a testament to, you know, you're not alone in what you're experiencing, but also it's not just you. Like, we really need to make sure that our understanding of mental health and climate change is both intersectional and also radical. And I really love the word radical because it derives from the Latin meaning root. And so it means getting to the source of things. And so for me, I really try and operate from a systems change perspective, looking at how the system that we live in is actually cultivating ill mental health, not just through, you know, proximal impacts of climate change, but long-term impacts of colonialism and capitalism as well. And one thing that I think is really important for me when it comes to talking about climate grief, and I actually really do appreciate the term, is that there is an element to it which acknowledges the temporal loss of, you know, things that have happened to people who are on the front lines. And I think that that gives credence to those experiences, whereas other terms, not necessarily, but do tend to focus on the future. And I think that if we make sure that our understanding is not only intersectional, but also mindful of timescales and those who have been enduring climate grief for a long time, we can really start to reorientate this conversation towards those who are stewards of the land and also know what the solutions are to tackling something like the climate crisis. And so for me, my climate grief is one that really tries to appreciate that, but also from my own perspective, understand the many ways that climate change is an intersectional issue. So I mentioned when I started that I left Hong Kong because of the national security law, and political freedom to me is essential to climate justice. And so for me, grieving a city that once was what was considered more politically free is also part of my climate grief, because that is something that allows me to process what it means to actually take climate action, and with that rectify things like climate grief, whereas we don't have those liberties anymore. So it's a loss of freedom that really impacts the way in which people in my community can actually campaign for climate justice. So that is me in a nutshell. And I'm really looking forward to, continuing this conversation.
Thank you so much, Tori. Thank you for laying that foundation for us. Kyle is our next speaker, and I'm wondering, Kyle, if you can tell us a little bit about your work and how climate grief manifests in your work and impacts you and your community.
Yeah, bonjour, everyone. My name is Kyle Hill. I'm an assistant professor at the University of North Dakota in the Department of Indigenous Health. I have a PhD in clinical psychology, worked for several years as a clinical director and a training director. And during that time, I went back for my MPH. In that process, I started to understand a little bit more completely about how Indigenous health kind of operates at the intersection of climate change and I think, as Tori mentioned, issues with climate justice and social justice overall. And sorry, I'm at a coffee shop, so if you hear that, that's the cappuccino machine going off. This is the best place I could find right now. I'm traveling. And so currently what I have going on is research projects on looking at how Indigenous traditional ecological knowledges can be of specific utility to the climate crisis, especially, I guess, specifically in looking at climate adaptation and mitigation. Importantly, because we're all on Indigenous lands, and I guess as an aside, I should say we're traveling, and I'm currently on Seminole lands here in Florida. So appreciate that start to the conference or meeting here. But I guess, for me, climate grief as an Indigenous person, I'm enrolled in the Turtle Mountain Band of Ojibwe and also a descendant of the Siston-Wahpeton and Cheyenne River Sioux tribes in South Dakota. I guess the term ecological grief really resonates because I think about our history of colonialism that has impacted our communities in what I would consider genocide, right? And a part of that was the land dispossession and the forced removals that we experienced. Like for us as a people, it's like I make my home in St. Paul, Minnesota, and that's special to me because as a Dakota person, those are my original territorial homelands. However, we were removed forcibly in what I would consider like a concentration camp known as like Fort Snelling in the 1862 US and Dakota War. And we were moved to South Dakota. That's why a lot of the Dakota tribes are in South Dakota now. But what we experienced then is really this kind of, I feel like we're stuck within this place where we're trying to relearn our cultures, our traditions, and especially these traditional knowledges that are so vital to, again, as I said, the climate adaptation mitigation that we so desperately need, but also to be able to recognize and identify with our tribal and traditional homelands that are spiritual in nature. So as Tori said before, I think she mentioned the temporal relationship of climate, of environment, and grief. And I would also go one step further and say that this also transcends, I think, space, and place, because as Indigenous people, we have a spiritual relationship with our sacred places and our traditional homelands, and that's been severed over time. And now in this place, in this time, we're being asked to harness our traditional knowledge systems to be able to then develop, really co-construct adaptation models and programs for our nations and states. And so therein, you kind of see that problem that we all experience, or that dilemma that we're just trying to relearn and especially revitalize our languages, our cultural systems and traditional belief systems, and organize and center our nations in a place of like sovereignty. And at the same time, there's this push. And so there's certainly a dilemma. And so I think in a nutshell, really, climate grief to me is all of that, is watching and seeing our traditional homelands be dominated, and understanding that history, while at the same time trying to revitalize that relationship to our traditional homelands. And that creates certainly an anxiety, but also a feeling of loss. I'll stop there just to continue, but thank you. It's great to be with everyone.
Thank you, Kyle. We hear you. I'm wondering if we can pass it over now to Leslie. And Leslie, can you tell us a little bit more about your work and how climate grief impacts you and your community?
Thank you. Just want to say also a welcome to everyone. It's so great to see all of you who have joined in today. I use the pronouns she, her, and I'm calling in from the land of the Puyallup tribe and the Salish peoples in Tacoma, Washington. And my background is in mental health. And probably about 15 years ago, I had my own sort of climate awakening, where all the things I was hearing about climate change just dropped down from my head into this heart-based, visceral awareness of what we're really facing. And it was at that point when I decided to turn as much as I could of my personal energy and my professional efforts toward what I could contribute. And this was before terms like eco-anxiety or environmental grief were very common. But we were saying, well, climate change is caused by human behavior, but there were no behavioralists participating at that point. And I started to look at, well, what is it in the training I received about dealing with grief, or supporting lifestyle changes, or facilitating what could be contentious conversations, or recognizing our hidden beliefs hidden from ourselves that become the lens through which we relate to other people and our world around us. And I started to realize how essential this piece was to all the other kind of actions that were taking place. And I tend to think of it as our internal ecosystems, meaning our thoughts, feelings, nervous system, cannot be severed from our external environment, and how integral they are and how much they influence each other all the time. So that kind of set me on my path of helping to define what climate psychology might look like. And it's taken several directions of training the mental health professionals. Unfortunately, there's no requirements at this point in any of the licensing tracks to include working with climate triggered distress. Bringing some of these tools into places like governmental and nonprofit organizations where people are doing this work, but not always with resources for their own support and well-being. And most recently, there's been a lot of interest in how can we support kids, and is there a way to actually bring it into the schools that's not only the science, but with this social emotional tool side by side so that it's a much more integrated learning model. So, and I'd say, you know how when you become aware of something like whatever it is, a particular kind of tree or something, you start to notice it in a lot of places. And so I feel like I've become very sensitized to my own climate grief. So whenever I witness something or hear a news story, there's this, you know, sort of brush against that place in my heart. And I'd say I've been learning to sort of navigate the waves of that over these years. And I'll pause there.
Thank you, Leslie. You know, these are incredibly disheartening times, and the focus of having this panel come together today is the idea that on one side there's stress and struggle and crisis and trauma regarding ecocide, regarding ecological destruction, regarding the climate crisis, and yet how can we move toward a lesson, toward learning, toward inspiration, toward the action and the work that we need to do to undergo this deep transformation that's needed in the world. And what I'm going to do with the order this time is go in the reverse. So we're going to actually go back to Leslie first.
Okay. Well, one thing about grief and other forms of distress is that I've experienced, and I've seen this in others, that there's often a shock element. It kind of shatters whatever it might be, our sense of safety, our faith in governments that we thought might be more active than they've proven to be, the way we understand the world, or our general sense of safety, wherever it might be. And while that is extremely painful, it also pulls down the veils that cover our eyes, right? Because our evolutionary psychology makes us creatures of habit because it filters out things to kind of just be able to deal with life more easily, but it also deadens a lot of our awareness. And so these painful moments and this painful awareness shatters that in a way that we can see more clearly. It can make our heart more open. It helps us think outside the box because the box doesn't work anymore. And I don't know if the word transformation has been used yet, but I do see it as very transformative. Everyone's been speaking to that. We can't just reduce the carbon in the atmosphere and make those kinds of changes. But as Tori and Kyle have been saying, how did we even get here? And to go to those deeper roots that are internal again and external, to even be able to recognize it. It's not an individual action, but to get clear about what each of us is able to do and capable of contributing in this larger collective shift.
Thank you, Leslie. Kyle, back to you with the same question.
I think if the question is, tell us a little bit about stress, trauma, crisis regarding ecocide or the climate crisis and how it created space for learning, inspiration, action, motivation to bring about transformation, right? Okay. Yeah, I think for me, I think personally, this has been a struggle in this work because we don't always get the opportunity to engage or be active, whether that's, as an activism or whether that's in our resistance to these efforts. Because of the day-to-day, we have families, we have jobs, we have stuff like that may not always champion, this work. And the struggle for me is time, and anxiety that I'm not doing enough. And so as an Indigenous person, and I'll always go back there because that sets the foundation for this work for me. I think what is enough is being on traditional homelands, understanding that, I'm raising a daughter and showing and displaying those values for her to soak in and stuff like that. but then also stewarding this work in a good way, within a collective and within community. And that's very important. And so I think, when I consider the stress of it, I think it's that anxiety that just simmers, right? And I think something that really helped transform that, was taking a different perspective on the climate crisis, because thinking of it as a climate crisis is just like steeped in anxiety, and I feel like it's going to bubble over. But a mentor of mine works in the field of planetary health. And so when I started to read about planetary health and understand it a bit more, I started to recognize, or I guess appreciate, that this is what we're all working toward, is planetary health. And it's this deeper connection and relationship with our ecosystems and our environment, recognizing that we're just a small piece of this ecosystem, but we are, most importantly, a piece of the ecosystem that we're in. We're not separate, right? And so within that kind of planetary health, like, epic or that, that under, I don't know, concept is like, how can we achieve wellness? It's almost like taking a wellness perspective as opposed to like an illness perspective, which is, coincidental to how we look at medicine, at least in the United States. You know what I'm saying? And how we look at as mental health providers, we have to seek a diagnosis first. How are you unwell? So that we can figure out how to treat you, And so I feel like that's how we look at climate change and the climate crisis. How are you unwell? And so we're constantly getting inundated with messages of how our Earth and our planet and our ecosystems are unwell. But yet there are so many ways that we can recognize the wellness and start to learn that and understand that and develop relationship or kinship to it, which is, I think, our next question. And be able to help revitalize or champion those strengths. And, when we do that and we create those connections, that only strengthens our ecosystems, because we're developing that relationship and making it stronger. So I think, that's the biggest way that I can, convey the transformation that I've experienced, because we can't sit there in the crisis and feel motivated. I think that takes away from motivation. And that's when we start to see anxiety turning into depression, hopelessness, helplessness, haplessness, and I think that also takes away from our ability to be active in resistance efforts that we also need to take part in. At the same time, right? Because we all feel like this is hopeless or this is helpless. So what are we going to do? What's our place? But as a collective, when we understand that, we call Mother Earth like Unshi Maka as Dakota people, like when we understand like this is our care, like we're caretakers of Unshi Maka. We pray to her, we sing to her, we suffer for her, understanding that with that, like she provides for us everything that we need, everything that we and we deserve this, right? The wellness that the earth provides, but it has to be a bi-directional kind of relationship, and so with that, I guess, that's all I have for this question. So I'll pass it now, but I really appreciate this question. It made me think.
Thank you, Kyle, for your rich answer. And Tori, the question's to you. Do you want me to repeat it? Are you?
No, it's all good. Thank you for your answers, Leslie and Kyle. They were really insightful. And I think there's a lot that I really resonate with as well. One thing that I think was mentioned was the power of community. And, I think it's really important to acknowledge, again, that whatever feelings that people are experiencing, whatever struggles they're experiencing, they're not in silos and you're not alone in experiencing them. And I think that tender reminder in and of itself can maybe inspire people to find like-minded folks who are also struggling. And like we are gathered here today, I just want to take a second to appreciate how important it is to be in community with others and to have these conversations. And to me, that is also part of the solution. And one thing that I really, really want to stress as well is that, these struggles are overwhelming by all means. They are multifarious. There are different ways of interpreting them. People have very personal and unique experiences with regard to things like climate grief or otherwise. But over the years, a lot of literature and research has been coming out that looks at how some of these emotions and experiences can be very adaptive, and also a reminder of how we're human. And I think that when you really try and reframe your relationship with them, it can remind you that, yes, like this is fundamentally reminding us that we are human and that our wellness is connected with the wellness of the planet, and also spurs us on to seek others who can support us in this. And as we kind of navigated, the world as it is, increasingly communities are being separated and dismantled in favor of neoliberal capitalistic ideologies of, autonomy and also quote unquote resilience, which do not conform to, my definitions of resilience. And I think that part of challenging that is creating community structures of care that actually forego the need to commodify every form of care, the need to individualize and pathologize every single problem that we're experiencing. And one thing that I've been completely sort of consumed by over the last particular period is how, for instance, with the COVID-19 pandemic, that had such a profound experience on people's mental health. And, a lot of academics and researchers were quick to go, no, this is a very normal reaction to what we're experiencing. And I would also ask that we extend the same grace for what's happening with the climate crisis. This is a very normal reaction to living through a time of climate breakdown. And when I talk in my book about this power of community, it's also really important to recognize that we have to acknowledge those who have lived through different forms of oppression. And with that, the ways in which they have cultivated resilience can actually teach us a lot about what it means to be in community. Apologies, I've got a cough and a cold. And, part of my solution to this is also understanding that we have much to learn from others who have lived through other existential crises, and also recognizing that this Western perception of what the climate crisis entails may not necessarily be the first existential threat to a lot of communities around the world. It's not to say that they're not interconnected with the climate crisis, but an example that I use is that my friend Laura, who I interviewed, she's from a peasant community in Colombia, and her fear as an environmental defender is of the militia and the police. And that's not to say that she doesn't resonate with terms like eco-anxiety and climate grief, but she says, there are lots of things that we have to consider that maybe folks in the global north who occupy positions of privilege don't necessarily have to consider. And so for me, unpacking some of those ideas really points to the fact that we need to center frontline struggles, but also understand the ways in which they have navigated these existential crises for generations, and with that, the resilience that they've had to cultivate. And more often than not, you find that community care comes into the picture time and time again. And, when speaking to some folks who I interviewed from West Africa, who were talking about the concept of Ubuntu, and also how they were talking about, caretaking and child rearing and family structures beyond the, heteronormative nuclear archetype, and also breaking down those boundaries, as we'll see in the next question about kinship. Who's kin? The earth is kin. Everyone is kin. You begin to realize that our capacity for care is so much bigger than what we're taught to believe here in the West. And I think that holds the key to our solution of how to mitigate not only climate grief, but also climate crisis as a whole. And also with that, if we're going to be really frank, separating us from this earth as a home is part of the problem why we're here. It's made it a lot easier for socioeconomic systems to commodify that which are considered kin and turn them into resources to be extracted until they collapse. This is not a natural occurrence. And so for me, really challenging that and going back to a very holistic view of community, one that transcends not only the nuclear family, but also environments and people as well.
Thank you, Tori. I feel like you've done a really good job of bridging together a lot of the complex issues, and it sets us up nicely for the next question, which we'll pass over to Kyle. Kyle, we're wondering, how do the values of kinship help us build resilience? How does coming into relationship with each other in the more than human world build resilience?
Yeah, I think, resilience in and of itself has um, not, I think, stood up too well to our needs in the climate crisis, because resilience operates off of this belief or understanding as a concept that we have to get beat down first, right? And so I think all too often we think about people that need to be resilient. They need to be resilient. And certainly our planet has to be resilient now, but that's only because of the impacts of colonialism on our lands, our ecosystems, and our bodies, right? And as Tori mentioned, the commodification in our economies that are built on actually on extracting, whether that's extracting from the bodies of people or extracting from the body of our earth. And so we're at a place where we are broken, right? We've been broken. And it seems, at least on the surface, that mental health is here only to operate to keep broken things going, broken people going, right? Because we don't understand or we don't recognize trauma before a person was born. And certainly in our community as Indigenous people, what we recognize as historical trauma or intergenerational trauma looks at that. It understands that. We think about, again, as I said, the land dispossession that happened, right? Our connection to our territorial homelands, the place where we put down offerings and our prayers rest, and our people recognize through their creation stories to be from, we've been severed from that forcibly, right? So we have to think about that in and of itself. As when you think about ecocide, that's part of the genocide of Indigenous peoples. But we were resilient, right? We learned how to grow corn in different environments. We learned how to, as Anishinaabe people, harvest rice off waters that our creation stories and our traditional stories told us as we migrated from the East Coast into the Great Lakes region. So that's part of who we are now, right? And so when I think about kinship, I think that first and foremost, we have to develop or actually reestablish and revitalize this concept of kinship from a place of someone doesn't have to undergo abuse before and be resilient and bounce back before they're considered human, or before we have to say, there's humanity, right? I think we can start from just a place of humanity. We can treat people with respect, and we can treat the land with respect. And the kinship there, I think, is recognizing that on principle and what we would consider natural law, is that we treat our ecosystems and our most delicate relatives as kind of family members, all the same, right? So it doesn't matter if it's plants or animals or it's our waters. We treat them and we love them and we care for them, right? Because we are all stewards of land somewhere. And so I think, as an aside, that's part of it too, is recognizing where are our homelands? Where do we belong to, right? Because you belong somewhere. And so when I think about like white supremacy, right, I think this is where we really have to form that front line of sorts, is that resistance effort has to be on grappling with white supremacy as a community, as a collective here, because of the very explicit extractive nature of whiteness in and of itself, right? And so, again, going back to natural law, and the principle here is because it does it's essentially antithetical to the kinship that we're going to need to be able to work within and combat this climate crisis to achieve planetary health. So I think, that's what I think about resilience. That's how I think about kinship, and if we understand it according to, our Indigenous communities, that I really do feel like we need to start to follow and bring into these deserve their own table and be brought into this conversation, is that we need to recognize how historically we've lived with the environment, sustainable practices, and our traditional practice and cultures, and our spirituality that exists kind of in concert with our traditional territories. So yeah, I think I'll stop there, but I really love this question. Kinship is so very important because we're a part of the same web. So thank you.
Thank you, Kyle. I'm really moved by the nuance that you've provided with the term resilience and kind of flipping it over for us. I think that's really helpful. The next question is going to go to Leslie, and I'm wondering about the advantages and disadvantages of the current mental health field. We're sitting here talking about all these big systemic issues that are interrelated. What are the advantages, disadvantages of the current way that we're doing mental health in the field? And similarly, are there other alternatives bubbling up?
Yes, thank you so much. It's a really important question. Like absolutely every discipline and institution and field that is in existence, it needs to be in a process of re-examination and shift to be part of this collective change and transformation that we're talking about, and mental health is no exception to that. It has embedded within us, in it to a large degree, in the traditions it's come from, to be very hyper individualistically focused. It's not always easy or affordable to get access to mental health care. And as I mentioned earlier, at this point in time, although there are a lot of efforts to change this, there's no training or discussion about climate triggered distress for mental health professionals. So it's really a slow moving behind the times institution at this point. Now, that's not to say that I'm the only voice here. There are collectives happening, workshops being offered to break this down and redefine it in new ways. And one of the terms I just want to come to, because it relates to something Kyle was saying, is even the term resilience is being redefined. So more conventionally, and if you look it up on Wikipedia, it'll talk about bouncing back after a stressful time or a trauma or a difficult event. But we're starting to say that, especially in the face of the climate crisis and planetary health, that it's really more about cultivating the capacity to be present with more, without retreating, without becoming reactive, keeping that empathetic relationship, presence, open-heartedness in the face of increasing stress, because that's the trajectory that we know that we're on right now as it relates to the climate science. So tools around bringing more of our humanity forward, bringing more of our presence forward. And again, mental health has had little pockets of stretching out. I worked for a long time in health psychology, where things like cancer support groups were one of the ways to embrace a larger and collective way of working. But there's so much more to be done. And I honestly believe that a lot of the tools I mentioned, like facilitating conversations and deep listening, and some of the tools and practices for self-regulating the nervous system, don't have to be done by a mental health professional. I think we can break down some of that and make these more generously available. And I'm also a big fan of what I call guerrilla therapy, which is, where can it live where rather than individuals having to seek out a professional, where can these times to come together and talk or learn a breathing technique or whatever it might be happen where people already gather? Could it be at the YMCA? Could it be in faith communities? Could it be in book clubs? And to just, you know, break down those silos that Tori was talking about. There's some training and things that would help make that possible for the broader number of people to pick up some of these facilitations, but it's not that hard to do. And I'm really in support of that. I think the other part, and it's coming a little bit into play through the emphasis in eco-psychology, is again that relationship with nature. And it's not only what's our relationship to that, but how are we affected, and to recognize that that flows both ways. And again, that those divisions don't exist in the way that we tend to conceptualize it. And I'll just offer just a suggestion about this idea of building a greater sense of kinship is, you know, the next time you're out and about, just pause at a tree or a bush and, you know, and notice, you know, what is your association with that? It provides shade, it provides beauty, it's a commodity. You want to put wood floors in your kitchen. What else? What else? Pause and peel it back to the next layer. How do you feel when you're there? You know, what might you consider about how it's stabilizing the soil and part of cleaning the air and part of the breath you're breathing right then and there? And what is that relationship? There are some simple, easy ways to bring this more into being. Or when you turn on your faucet, you know, where so many things we do unconsciously, it's that same water, right? That's passing through all those pipes and connected to our rivers and lakes and oceans. And hoping to bring that awareness wherever you are, whatever your living situation may look like, we can bring that awareness of that aliveness and interdependence back. Okay, I'll pause.
Yeah, thank you, Leslie. I love the invitation to bring our awareness to the deep inner relatedness that exists, that I think the dominant culture has us often forgetting about. I'll pass the next question to Tori, and I'm wondering, what are the benefits and the limitations of conventional activism? So what are other pathways for engagement and involvement if perhaps protesting or participating in marches is not available to us? How can we become activated in these times?
Thank you for that question, Lauren. Thank you for everybody's answers so far. So I've doesn't actually mean. Can you hear me all right? Sorry, it's just
We can hear you now. It froze for a moment, but you're back with us.
Okay. I'm back. Yeah, and for me, you know, if we really look at the definition of the word activist, what it means is to take social political change, and really that can be anything. And I founded this organization with a friend of mine called Bad Activist, and it's a play off of Roxane Gay's Bad Feminist, and it's a tender reminder that our humanity is rooted in imperfection, and that by virtue of the systems that we live in, it is impossible to be perfect, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. And so through this lens of Bad Activist, Julia, my friend, she said to me, well, actually activism is really low-hanging fruit. All you have to do is take social or political change, do something like that, whatever that means to you. And it can be small, it can be big, it can be going to a protest, it can be writing something. You know, activism has so many different forms. And I think the sort of mainstream conventional idea of, say, a climate activist is one who goes out on the streets. And I have a lot of respect for people who partake in direct action. It's also something I do myself. I see its importance. It's really, really fundamental in community organizing, but also a lot of people don't relate to it. There's a lot of safety issues concerned with it. Some of my friends who are disabled are like, realistically, I can't just go out into the streets. You know, many of my Black peers are like, well, there's a lot of police brutality. I can't just, you know, protest without thinking about my safety. And so I think we need to not only make these safe spaces, but also try and incorporate different understandings of what activism means. And for me in writing, I actually also considered that a form of meditative activism in its own sense. It was very, a slow process of trying to culminate different ideas, bring in different voices, many of whom are on the front lines, many of whom are doing direct action themselves. And so for me, my activism is very, dependent on what I'm doing at the time and who I'm talking to, but it's never invalidated. I never feel like what I'm doing isn't enough. And I think this bad activist framing has really helped me with that, because it reminds me that I'm just one person and really the power is in the collective. And I think that also takes away some of the pressures and obsessions with trying to be perfect. I try my best to lead a so-called sustainable lifestyle, but at the same time, I also have to remind myself that there are systems in place that literally prevent you from living the most sustainable that you can. And there are also organizations who are profiting off of this planet's destruction. For instance, the fossil fuel industry. And one example that I really like to, reiterate is how the fossil fuel company BP coined the term carbon footprint. And that shouldn't detract from us looking at our impact on the planet. I definitely think individual and system change can go hand in hand, but it really does remind you that there is almost this insidiousness where people focus so much on the individual that we don't even recognize the systems of oppression that are literally creating this crisis as it is. And I think collective power really speaks to how we can come together and show up as individuals. And in my book, I talk about the power of individuality, which is not to be confused with individualism. And so for me, individuality is understanding your unique role in the climate movement, in any movement for that matter, but not acting in a way that perpetuates selfishness and destruction of the world around you. Whereas individualism for me is acting with your own self-interest and actually not even really considering the ways in which you can show up authentically. You don't have to be the same as everybody else. You don't have to take action that you don't want to, replicate, similar to people who are going out and protesting. If that's not your thing, then that's okay. You can show up authentically as you are in a way that makes sense to you, whether that's organizing with your community, whether that's writing, doing art. I feel like there are so many different ways to take action. And for me, that's really, really important. And also, I keep going back to this concept of community, and it's not static and it's not prescriptive, but I do want to leave you with a quote that really speaks to so many different things, including, aspects of kinship. And as a climate activist, a lot of people talk about, this idea that we're defending nature, but we're not defending nature, we're nature defending itself. And I think that really speaks to this power of coming together, of recognizing all of these different interconnected systems, recognizing that we're not just one tiny, static individual in this whole web of community. And that has brought a lot of solace for me in recognizing that I can't be perfect, and that, all I can do is my best, and working together is, something that I think all of us can achieve in a time of crisis.
That's wonderful. So we have an invitation for each one of us to become bad activists and to collectivize. That's what I'm getting from you, Tori. Thank you. That is the bulk of our questions for now. I'm going to hand it back over to Andy, because I think we're going to start answering some questions that came in through the chat. Thank you to the panelists so much for your insights and for showing up today. I really am feeling very grateful, and I'm going to sit with a lot of the ideas that bubbled up. Thank you.
Laura, so there's an invitation, as you said, to become bad activists, but there seems to be an invitation to become a vegetarian or vegan. Alexandra posted this question. How would the speakers relate to concepts of climate grief and palliative care to the 57 billion animals killed annually in animal agriculture in the US alone? I'm curious also about your thoughts on changing our diets as a small, sweet step towards change or transformation.
Yeah, do any of the panelists feel moved to answer? All right, Tori.
Yeah, I'd love to. I don't think that being vegan is necessarily the only prerequisite to being an environmentalist. I have been vegan for 8 years, and I'm very much, someone who advocates for total liberation, whether that's people and non-human animal others. But I also think that there's so much nuance to these conversations. But I will say that industrial agriculture is destroying the planet. And in doing so, we're also sacrificing the lives of many sentient creatures who have not been killed in a humane way and in a reciprocal way, in a way that's honoring the land and also people's traditional ways of living as well. One thing that I actually write about in my book is, again, with this idea of kinship, how we have really tried to reduce certain animals to commodities and others as companions. And I think there's some really fantastic work out there done by various anthropologists and also researchers in the field who look at these human animal connections and the many ways in which they can exist. But for me, I'm particularly interested in how we're very, very quick to commodify certain animals and how actually a lot of that's related to feminism as well, with the way in which the female animal body is commodified for human patriarchal gain as well. And so I do feel like that's also part of this bigger conversation of kinship, like who do we give sentience and personhood to, and who do we look at as just mere, commodities, as I mentioned, to eat or consume. And I think that having an intentional relationship with the being that ends up on your plate is paramount to this. Like, where does your food come from? Who are you eating? Like, how are you eating them? All of these different things. And I think that there's a real sensitivity to it as well, because we also need to make sure that we're not just going, veganism is the solution to the climate crisis. It's a very, very intersectional issue that needs to make sure that food justice is at the center of it as well, because it's not accessible to everyone. And it's also not necessarily in line with traditional ways of living for many communities. I traveled to Colombia and stayed with my friend who's from the Arahuacos indigenous community of the Sierra Nevada. And to me, their living is the testament of sustainability. They rear and grow all of their own food, including livestock who they treat with utmost respect. And for me, as a vegan, seeing that, I felt more reassured by that than any other industrial process of consumption that I've seen. And that to me is also like what it means to live with the land. There was so much respect for the livestock that was being consumed. And so I also feel like we need to make sure that these conversations are nuanced. They're not, black and white, so to speak. So that's just, my 2 cents on that question.
Thank you, Tori.
I also wanted to answer too real quick. I agree with Tori 100%. I think that the food systems are, again, one of those systems that are built to really disrupt our ability to eat in a sustainable way or recognize that relationship to our environments and ecosystems in a meaningful way. So again, I think as Tori mentioned previously, there are systems in place that disallow us the opportunity or don't privilege us the opportunity to be able to make efforts towards, reasonable kind of adaptation or mitigation efforts towards climate change. I think the disruption of our relationship to our lands in the way of disrupted food systems for indigenous people was one of the main factors, whether that was, water insecurity that affected our agricultural opportunities historically, or whether that was removal from our traditional homelands that disrupted our ability to hunt and gather in our traditional homeland. So now what we see for our tribes in particular is that our traditional relationship to a lot of these non-human relatives, for example, for us as Dakota and Lakota people, is bison or buffalo. They were slaughtered in much the same way that our own people experienced genocide in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So many people have seen a picture of white men standing on top of what looks like 1 million buffalo skulls. That should be in a lot of people's brains. But that was essentially the pinnacle of that. And one anthropologist had said that at about 1890, there was as low as 250,000 American Indian people in the United States. And during that time, or shortly thereafter, while they were building the railroads, the population of buffalo was almost decimated. They were almost extinct, right? And so our traditional stories tell us that we, as humans, are very much rely on our animal populations, and some of these are our brothers and sisters, right? So as Lakota people, we call it Teoyate, which is our Buffalo Nation, but that's who we're related to. So some of the stories will tell us that if this animal should suffer or go extinct, that means our people are going to suffer and go extinct. And so for us, as Lakota people, it's if those buffalo suffer, so will we. As Anishinaabe people, we see that, if sometimes we see that if the wolves suffer, so will we. Or, so these are the things that we live by. So going back to resistance or activism efforts, it's if we see things that threaten our water or our ecosystem, sometimes that's our own survival kind of peaking up. And I don't think many people understand that. And so just a little bit, and I think, looking at our food systems in particular, like there were hundreds of varieties of corn for some indigenous communities, hundreds, right? If not thousands. And now we have one color of corn that we all eat, right? And why is that? And I think that those are the sorts of questions that we need to, at an individual level, start to grapple with. And once we're able to reconcile that and grow our own corn, I think that's when we can start to understand, like, how can we participate in this larger conversation around our food systems, and how that's kind of co-conspired with the climate crisis at this really macro level within these systems. So yeah.
I have another question here from Lauren. Lauren, if you're still here and you'd like to ask this question yourself, I invite you to unmute. I'll give you a few seconds to do that if you wish. If not, I can ask it for you. It's up to you.
Hi, Andy. I'm here. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to all the panelists for all of your insightful comments and just your perspectives on these interconnected issues. Oh, I don't have my video on. Hi. My question really comes from a place of being in transition right now from experiencing a lot of what I would call climate despair and anguish. Sometimes I see the term climate grief and I don't even relate to it because it feels like a step beyond where I am right now. But some things that have been really helpful to me are practices within the arts and mindfulness, meditation, embodiment, connected to the theme of community that everyone has been talking about. And I see these things now as deeply interconnected with mental health care. And so I'm wondering how these types of things are reconceptualizing what we think of as mental health care. And if the panelists can comment on their experiences with that.
I'd love to jump in on that one. Yes, I agree with you completely. And I think it's important to know that as all of us are seeking ways to come home to ourselves so that we can be present and active, that it can look like many, many things. I like to give the example of a 13-year-old girl that I've worked with who her favorite way of sort of grounding is to go skateboarding. And that's because she has to really be in her body. She has to really pay attention to the environment she's in. She gets into this kind of groove where she's just working with herself in the environment. And it's nothing that would work for me and nothing I would be inclined to prescribe, right? So whether it is yoga or mindfulness, whether it is going for a run, whether it is painting or listening to or playing music or calling a friend or whatever it may be, it's absolutely vital to find those ways that nourish yourself. And some may be individual, some may be in groups. But sort of like Tori was saying about forms of activism, it can look like many, many things. And same thing with how to nourish and connect, to take a walk outside, whatever it may be, to garden. I personally join you in loving the arts. My first profession and first degree were in dance. And I feel as though, even though I'm not actively dancing a lot these days, what that taught me and what that gave me somehow still informs the way I work and has a real, body-based orientation to knowing. So I'll pause there.
Thank you, Leslie. Can I slip in just a quick answer as well? I think an important practice is getting back to ritual and ceremony and moving some of these emotions together so that it's not just privatizing our pain, but we're bringing it to each other to hold more collectively.
I'd also love to just quickly jump in, and I hope this isn't, too, it shouldn't be contentious, but I'm really interested in the power of psychedelics as a way in which to create space for grief and healing. And I know that obviously we're going through what many call a psychedelic renaissance at the moment, but we also need to acknowledge that many of these substances have been long-term used by Indigenous peoples around the world. And we need to honor the fact that many have been used in traditional ways of healing in community. And I think there is so much transformative potential for some of these substances to create space for people to process trauma and grief. And in full transparency, I was diagnosed with multiple forms of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And I don't think I would be here today, in all honesty, without help from psychedelics. Genuinely, I use them in a very intentional, healing way, and in a way that was done with community. And for me, it was an invitation to be mindful, but also to really rewrite some of the emotions and the feelings that had been literally cemented in my body for a really long time. I think somatic healing as well went very, very powerfully hand in hand with that. And I'm particularly interested as well in the work of Stacey Haynes and what she does with generative somatics. And I think that there are many people who use plant substances in Indigenous methods of healing alongside some of these forms of somatic healing. And for me, that's where I've had the most success in my mental health journey. Of course, everyone is very unique and different with how they choose to navigate things. But with that came a lot of mindfulness. But it was, and to reiterate it time and time again, it was done with community. It was done with the support of my peers. It was done in a way that nourished and held me. And I think that, yeah, it really transformed me, not only as a person, but also as an activist. And so, yeah, I just wanted to share that personal aspect of my journey as well.
There was another interesting question that I might ask Libby, if she's willing to ask it herself, about public craftivism as a grief and resilience ritual. Libby, are you willing to unmute and ask?
Hi, I suppose so. It's so valuable hearing everyone speak about the need for a collective kind of ritual toward resilience, toward community. And I think that because so many of our public instruments for discourse around systems have broken down, the work that I do at the university where I work has been a way for us to kind of create new public spaces. And I'm in the process of creating more robust systems of circularity between different entities on our campus, metallurgy and costumes and all of these things, so that we can not just recover things, but have the opportunity to ritualize them in a way that is creative reuse, creating something new, and that is also collective. But because so much of this renders our embeddedness in the Anthropocene, this recovering already man-made materials and transforming them into something else that are necessarily always separate from trees and grasses and things that are living things in our midst, creates a kind of tension for me and some resistance from people who want a kind of purity about our separateness and our relationship to the climate and our ecosystems. And so as a practice, I'm sort of interested in any thoughts that people have about how we navigate those spaces and those rituals for things that are not strictly embodied, and trying to use the materials that we already have. So thank you.
While you're mulling that over, Ellen had a question, curious about your perspectives on using public transportation to help with climate change by reducing emissions from using your own car.
I'll say a little bit to start us off on that one. I think depending where you live and how rural it is, or urban, or in between, influences some of what may be possible, especially in the short term for public transportation options. But what I do like about this question is, we've talked about intersecting issues and sort of a poly crisis. And I think we can approach things in a poly solution way as well. So if it is, for example, a more urban area, let's say, that gets areas get blocked off from cars, and it maybe becomes more walkable as well as public transportation, it benefits in multiple ways. If there's more foot traffic or bike traffic, often the local businesses get a boost. If it's made to be more walkable and more hangout space, it's often greened with how that area can be designed. And certainly, as we've said many times today, every institution we're looking at, whether it's how and where our food comes from, or how and where our transportation options lie, are important pieces of this larger one. I just think the complexity here is what may be possible based on the kind of community, where public transportation may not always be as accessible if things are more spread out.
Can I just add something? In the state of Connecticut, the governor is making public transportation on buses free. So it makes it easier to use the buses now. And I live in a fairly rural area. Yeah, I'm able to access bus lines that come right in front of my building. I live in a condo complex. So I actually can get a bus into a local town quite easily at many times of the day. So I don't use a car. And I walk a lot.
Ellen, that's a great model for everyone to consider as we go forward. We're at 2:15 now, and we are going to have 2 more sessions, including next week's, which is all about taking small, sweet steps towards action. Maybe before we go, I could ask our speakers briefly on the spot to think of one small, sweet step that folks here can take as we go forward. And I've posted in the chat here the link for all of you to register for these next 2 sessions. And I hope to see you all there. So I'll hand this over back to Leslie, Tori, Kyle, and Laura.
Well, I'd invite us all, if there's something that you've been almost ready to do, whether it's reaching out to a local organization or whether it's joining some kind of a climate cafe to work with your feelings, take this opportunity to take that one more step. We've talked a lot about how it can look like many different things depending where you are and in your life and in your land. So use this as that little bit of a boost to go ahead and take that next step.
Yeah, I'd love to echo what Leslie says. I will never get tired of talking about community. I think it's kind of my ethos for a lot of the work that I do. And, find people that that you can be in community with. And I think for many of us, we might feel like going to be part of a climate community is the first thing to do. And if that's accessible to you, then great. You can sometimes just Google, climate organization and name the place that you are. And sometimes you'll find different organizations that you can join. But also, I think there is a real power in sometimes not necessarily focusing on gathering specifically around the climate and finding people who are outside of that echo to talk about some of these topics. So, one thing that my friend does is they go to badminton, every week. And many of the people that they speak to aren't engaged in topics around climate justice, but actually that's a real opportunity, right? Because they're gathered there to play sport, but actually, they can talk about all of the different things that they work on and the things that they're interested in. And then that sparks a little, inspiration in someone to really consider the work that they do. And I think that also, tries to make sure that this work reaches far and wide and isn't just in little silos. I think it's really important to make sure that other people are engaged with the conversation, even if, they're not part of a climate group. So for me, that means bringing these conversations like the ones that we've had today to spaces that you already occupy. And so for me, that would be the ask.
Yeah, I would just echo the same, recommendation is find community and also just allyship in that community. As we mentioned before, for land acknowledgements, we're all on, Indigenous lands and territories on Turtle Island. Learning more about that, how you could be a good ally, or as we would say, a good relative, and find your community, a community that feeds you, not in a sustenance way like that, but really just feeds you spiritually, and a wellness. And really, I guess, rooting yourself in that notion of kinship that we talked about before, not resilience, but that really pure kinship that just brings positivity and love and joy to your life.
Yeah, thank you to the panelists. I'll add one more thing in that I think we're sold by the dominant culture that there's supposed to be one pathway, one way of doing things. And we really need to understand that there are multiple perspectives, multiple pathways. And in order to do that, we also have to learn how to be with our discomfort more, because some of those pathways might be unsettling to us. So my call to action, or my sweet step, is to start doing the inner work so we build some distress tolerance and can be with people who disagree with us in a civil way. And then also be with the pain of the heartbreak, because I think that pain has a lot to teach us as well.
Thank you, Laura, Leslie, Tori, Kyle, and everyone who's joined us today. I hope to see you all next week. Till then, have a wonderful day and see you all soon.